Well, I promised you easy, and here it is. So sit back and grab your pad and pencil and get ready to take notes as we talk about everything business right here on the Weekly Business Hour. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to start a new soup to nuts conversation, and I'm so pleased we have Doug Thorpe with us. We're going to be talking a little bit about leadership, but more particularly, I want to welcome Doug to the show. Doug, welcome.
Hi, Rick. Pleasure to be here.
Well, you know, Doug, we've got this soup to nuts conversation entitled Building Better Teams by Becoming a Better Leader. Great title. Doug, you're the creator of Leadership Powered by Common Sense. Tell folks what you did in creating that. Why'd you create that?
Yeah, Rick, that theme of thinking about your leadership in a common sense way is something that really comes from my many years of experience out in industry and in business. I've had a great opportunity in an early chapter in my life. I was a banker with what used to be Texas Commerce. It's now Chase. And I had the privilege of working with probably hundreds of customers, businesses of all kinds. We were predominantly a commercial bank at the time. I got to see entrepreneurs and business owners struggle with all the challenges that you can imagine. So what I realized over those many years is a lot of times solutions aren't complex. They can be pretty simple and often downright common sense. So about 10 years ago, when I started specifically coaching clients rather than consulting or advising in any other way, I realized that same principle still followed through. So I created a blog, and that is the tagline for my blog, Leadership Powered by Common Sense, and told that story all the way up to today. So,
well, that's also part of what I do is common sense, because I grew up in the business world from the time of birth, and it's something that people miss, the common sense aspect of business. Let's dive into this topic, though. This is really exciting stuff to me, and it's about building a team and so on and so forth. We're going to talk to you about this, but the successful team starts with, I would say, probably key leadership. In this case, we have a lot of business owners who listen to the program. Tell us a little bit about that and what some of the attributes of that key leader are.
Yeah, Rick. Yeah. Starting to create an effective team does start with the leader. So particularly in the entrepreneurial space, you've got a guy that or lady that starts a business. They've got a great idea, but pretty soon they discover they can't do it alone. So they start reaching out, bringing people into the fold. And surprise, surprise, you've just started creating a team. And whether you think of that team in a real hierarchical way or just simply the circle around you, you are the leader of that team if you're owning that business and trying to make it go. So the effectiveness of that team does come back to you as that owner and entrepreneur. You have to align your own skill sets as a leader in order to get the most out of that team. And, you know, we can talk about the basic attributes of leadership, things like having a vision, having your focus and transparency with the team, and begin to build all that. But we'll talk about that in more detail as we go here.
Well, you know, that's so important, and it's amazing to me that people say, I'm going to start a business. I talk to a lot of people, just sit down and I'll give them an hour of my time, and in fact, half of them I typically dissuade for various reasons, usually financial, but they all of a sudden may have been involved in a large organization like you early in your career. Now, all of a sudden, they're the boss. They're everything.
Right.
And I find a lot of people lacking those leadership skills, even basic, to build that team you're talking about. What's your advice to those people starting from day one?
Well, you're absolutely right, and that's the very reason I've created a whole sort of subset in my coaching to not simply focus on the individual owner, leader, senior executive, but to make them realize that their highest and best use is guiding that team around them, building a stronger, better, more productive team. And, you know, if they've never had that kind of experience leading a team, boy, there's an education to be found. And, you know, some of the best ways I tell people if they got to jumpstart that, if they don't have an idea really, they need to first focus on some leaders that they know of, maybe perhaps people they've worked for in the past that they admire and respect, and start cobbling together a picture of good leadership. And the easiest thing to do is start copying some of that, start doing those things that you remember those people doing.
Well, like you say, so many of them become, I believe, when I talk with them and then some of them I work with, they're just not prepared for that. It's such an important function and an ability to develop.
Right.
Well, let's talk about building the teams. How are teams formed?
Well, that's an interesting question. So there are a couple of predominant combinations of the way things do. Talking about the entrepreneur that's just started a business, and as I mentioned earlier, if they find themselves needing more people around them to get the job done, then they go out and hire or recruit people. So that is probably the traditional way, certainly for small and mid-sized businesses, how that begins to happen. In slightly larger organizations, what can happen is the CEO decides he's going to reorganize something. He picks a lieutenant to go run a team. That lieutenant finds himself with a group of people he maybe doesn't know, or frankly, in some cases doesn't like, and all of a sudden they've been anointed as his team. So that's certainly a different kind of challenge, but a challenge nonetheless.
Well, when you back to what I was talking about, the entrepreneur starts a business, so he hires that first person. He's got a team. Of course, that the changes that take place in that environment are obvious. But as you build a team of 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on people, what are some of the changes that take place as that team comes together?
Well, I've seen it happen over and over again. In the entrepreneur scenario, there's that pride of authorship. You've got the vision for why you started the company, and delegating that, or what it feels like giving up part of your control of that vision when you start adding other people, giving it up and delegating is the effective way to make that team perform. And you have to create in yourself a trust and willingness to do that delegation. And you can get derailed pretty fast if you start saying to yourself, well, I don't trust this person with this task. Well, then you probably made a bad hiring decision.
Yeah, it all comes back home to roost, and that is one of the most common challenges I see with anybody building their business is giving up certain tasks, responsibilities, and comfortably doing it. And I think sometimes they overlook the importance of making the hire that they will trust. Is that a fair?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's just amazing what folks do. Well, we got a manager beginning to build the team, or the owner in the case of a small business. What are the kind of things, why do they fail at this?
I think springboarding off of what we just said, I think as we hire our team members, we need to be sensitive to diving in and learning about their skill sets and their real abilities so that you can start leveraging the attributes and skills that you've hired. And you may discover in a brand new hire, you thought you hired them for X, but they're really good at Y. And now all of a sudden, if Y is a good element of your new company, then maybe you reassign them and give them more of Y and not X that you hired them for in the first place. So the point there is the owner needs to do something to really learn the people you've got. And in a smaller team, obviously that's easier to do, and but something that is frequently overlooked.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. Again, when you hire that person, you've got to have a mindset, I believe, that, hey, they're going to take over this, or I would like them to take over X. We'll start with Y and try to develop them. And so many times we just hire someone because they'll fill that first step and not necessarily have the ability to fill that second step. Have you found that to be true?
Yes, absolutely. And we find ourselves, and I myself, I definitely have firsthand experience trying to run a small business. I had a business in '03 and had 35 employees, but growing to that level was a stair-step process. And I'm not ashamed to admit I didn't do it all that well in the first couple of rounds of hiring. I went through a lot of people trying to find the ones that could really contribute to my team and ones that I could trust with that delegation and giving up of my part of it.
Well, we got a brand new manager, a brand new business owner. What can they do to get the best results? I mean, you've got all that experience. What have you learned that they can do to, say, make fewer mistakes?
That's a great question. And I just recently read one of my coaching colleagues' materials. He's got an acronym that he calls FAST, and it stands for Focus, Accountability, Simplification, and Transparency. And I think that's a great summation of really the key things that a new leader and a new owner has to do with building a team. You've got to be able to focus everybody. You yourself have to get focused. You can't be chasing bright, shiny objects, changing their priorities every day. You've got to get your plan in position and then share that vision and share that focus with your team and create some levels of accountability. Let everybody know what your expectations are for what they're going to do on your team and how they can contribute to the success of the organization. And then simplicity, it's kind of back to our tagline, common sense, don't overcomplicate it, make it simple for everybody to understand and translate. And then last is transparency. You as the leader of that team, you can't have any artificial walls built up. You've got to be able to be connected and in the moment with your team as things unfold.
How important is it, though, in your opinion, to be right there as they unfold and being responsive? In other words, communication. How important is that to the success?
It's very critical, and it does go back, and that's why I like that acronym, FAST. Being able to be accountable yourself and demonstrate accountability to your team by helping establish reasonable, achievable expectations. And then all of those should be tied back to your vision. They should be tied back to the focus. And too often I see entrepreneurs that have a genuine great idea, but they take so much pride in that authorship, they don't allow anybody else to contribute anything to it. And if you've hired the right team and given them some latitude, set some expectations, you might just be surprised at how great they can contribute to expand that vision or grow that vision.
Right. I don't think that you can really grow it without having folks help you along the way. So that's interesting. Ladies and gentlemen, we're to our first break. Believe it or not, we've already burned up about 15 minutes of this soup to nuts conversation. I ask that you please stay with us. We're going to come back and continue this discussion and conversation with Doug. And I'm going to ask him to share with us his 6 steps to building a highly effective team. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
Business on the Weekly Business Hour every Monday at 11 a.m. on Lone Star Community Radio.
Lone Star Community Radio is looking for those who are interested in hosting their own talk show with monthly and weekly slots available in Conroe's FM 104.5, 106.1, and on irlonestar.com. Start your own podcast, create your first YouTube channel, and be on TV. Contact Lone Star Community Radio online at irlonestar.com or call the station message line at 936-647-3776 to take your first step into the radio world.
Health Center Southeast Texas is a federally qualified health center. We accept Medicare, Medicaid, and most major private insurances. For our self-pay patients, we have a sliding scale discount program available. Our health centers have qualified providers and staff striving every day to provide the best quality of care to our patients. Services offered are family medicine, behavioral health services, telepsychiatry, and pediatrics. We have 4 area locations. Look up the Health Center Southeast Texas online at hcset.com.
Listen in Mondays at noon to hear Conroe news from local nonprofits, businesses, upcoming events, Conroe Park events, news stories, and information that matters to you with your host, Margie Taylor of Taylorized PR. For more information about being a guest, visit irlonestar.com/Conroe Culture.
Not sure who to turn to when you have a problem in your business? Listen to the Weekly Business Hour on Lone Star Community Radio.
You're listening to the Weekly Business Hour, and this is Rick Schisler, your host. We're having a soup to nuts conversation today with Doug Thorpe. Doug is talking to us about how building better teams by becoming a better leader. Well, Doug, when we went to break, we'd kind of gone through some scenarios, talked a lot about the beginning for either a new manager or a business owner and the kind of challenge they have in building that team from that first hire and so on and so forth. But you've come up with 6 steps to building a highly effective team, and I really like to take some real time and set these out because I think they're wonderful, wonderful guidelines for people as they build a team. So let's kick off and talk about the first one.
Yeah, you bet. What we've got here is, as you said, I've developed a 6-step plan, and really it is ultimately about building trust. Let me give you a backstory real quick. One of the great models of corporate giants, Google, did a 2-year study of their highest performing teams. They called it Project Oxygen. You can Google that, no pun intended. But there's a lot of great information in there. And what they found, the number one attribute that contributed to the most success of their best teams was building an attitude of trust. They called it psychological safety. I guess that's their political correct way of doing it. But if you read the report, it comes down to the trust factor. Can team players trust each other? Can they trust the leader? Can the leader trust them, et cetera, et cetera? And it becomes a kind of a cycle of success. So I've broken down that cycle into 6 steps. And by the way, if you have access to the website, you can look that up. We'll pull that chart up here, and you can follow along with me. The number 1 step is about people. And if you think about it, when you hire an employee, the first question in their mind is, do I even want to be here? Do I feel good about coming on board here? It's part of their decision process to accept your job offer. But even once they're in the seat, as they learn things about your business, they're going to be asking themselves that question, do I even want to be here? So that's really the starting point of addressing that. And as a manager, you have to know that that question's on the mind of your people. So you've got to do some things to work to overcome that, get them saying, yes, I want to be here. That leads to a second question, and you can kind of think of this maybe as building blocks in a hierarchy sort of thing, but the second question is purpose. They start asking the question, what is this team trying to accomplish? And that's where, in the first segment, we talked about focus. They have to understand the vision. So the leader has to share that purpose with them, has to get them to have clarity about it so that they can make a commitment to it.
Let me ask a quick question here, to kind of interrupt you on this. In the purpose, it strikes a chord. I'm going to use a very simple example. I'm an entrepreneur. I've opened a Main Street business, front door, retail, and I hire my first employee who's going to work that counter, going to interact with my customers. A very, very important position. I think a lot of times entrepreneurs, though, overlook that. But sharing the purpose with that person who's going to work the counter, customer service, clerk, so on and so forth. How do you share that successfully when you bring in an hourly person? And because I think you need to do it to make sure they understand more than how to work the register, how to check people out, how to answer the phone.
Yeah. Great point, and I agree with you totally. I guess I'll answer that question with a story of my own. Recently, my wife and I were out shopping, and we were in a Pier 1 import store. And the salesperson was incredibly keen with customer service, just very effusive, bubbly, personable, ready to answer any question we had. And I couldn't resist. After we had spent some time in the store, I went back to her and I said, let me ask you a question. I said, I'm a business coach, and I couldn't help but see your attitude and your approach. You work for a, not big box store, but you work for a retail chain. Where do you get that? What do they encourage you to do that? Are you trained to do that? What do you do? And she said, well, truthfully, it starts with me. I just believe that's what I need to be doing. And whether I worked here or somewhere else, I'd probably do that. And I thought, So that's about hiring. That's about finding that gleam in somebody's eye when that's the job you've got for them to do. And she said, yes, we've been trained on some things. I said, well, what's the key to that? What keeps you motivated? And she said, it's pretty simple. We're competing with e-commerce, and we're a brick and mortar store. If we don't give you this kind of service, you'll just go sit at home and be online shopping. But if we can give you this experience, you'll probably come back. And I said, yeah, you're absolutely right.
It makes a lot of sense, and that's a wonderful story. Well, what's the third attribute in your trust?
Yeah, so the third attribute has to do with the plan. And once you've understood the purpose, your team needs to now see the plan. And that's the how question. How are we going to get this done? How can we go from A to B? And what does that look like? And again, part of it is a critical judgment in the mind of the team member. They're saying, can I buy this? Does this make sense to me? Or is this just a ridiculous reach that is not going to end well? So as the leader, you've got to be able to lay out that plan, and you've got to let the team have a critical eye on it, give you the feedback that's appropriate to adjust the plan and make it doable by the team you've got.
So you've got the plan, you've got the purpose, you've got the people. Now what's next? Pretty logical, isn't it?
Pretty logical. It's practice, or a lot of coaches like to use the execute word. Can we go work on this? Can we deliver what's been done? And as you get into practice, then you can ask yourself, what's working, what doesn't work, what do I need to change, what do I need to adjust, what's my latitude for adjustment? So this is where, as a team, we get into all the elements of empowerment by the employee. Does the boss give you the permission to go do things on your own? Do you have levels of self-initiative that you can exercise? Is the atmosphere of delegation about permission and protection, or is it punitive? So that's where the practice kicks in.
Well, we've got a couple minutes left. You've got two more attributes, which I think are very important.
Yeah.
What are they?
Hit them real fast. Number 5 is performance. Again, all these questions come from the mind of the employee. The question is, how are we going to be measuring success? Is the measurement system fair and equitable? All the emerging statistics tell us the millennial workforce doesn't want annual reviews. They're not going to wait for them. You got to give them more instant feedback on how they're doing and what's going on. And then number 6 is the payoff. When we do all this work, boss, how are we going to get rewarded? Is it compensation, or is it achievement? As I was driving over here this morning, I thought about the idea, payoff can come in, it's not all about money and financial reward. I've done a lot of work in the past with nonprofits, and our payoff is seeing lives changed by the programs we're providing. So payoff can come in a lot of different ways, and contextually, whatever that is for your organization or your team, the payoff has to be clear, and it has to be awarded and rewarded. You put all these together, what you're striving to do is build momentum for your team. And when you've got all these hitting on all 6 cylinders, you will find there's an incredible level of trust among all the players. They can, as these questions come in their mind, they can help answer those questions between themselves, and they don't always have to come to the boss to get the answer for it. And you have this psychological safety in coming together as a team and working together.
Well, those 6 things, I think it's a wonderful opportunity to people to look at which you have the website page and understand this. Go back through them real quick, kind of summarize them for us the next minute or two, so we can kind of plant those in everybody's mind, because this will be a basis for what we talk about in the future conversations.
Yeah, so they are all P words. People is the first one, your employee asking the question, do I even want to be on this team? Number 2 is purpose. What's the team trying to accomplish? Number 3 is plan. How will the team get this done? Number 4 is practice. What works and what doesn't work? Number 5 is performance, how to measure the success we are trying to achieve. And number 6 is payoff. What will the reward or the outcome be?
And like you said, the payoff doesn't have to be monetary.
Doesn't have to be monetary.
Yeah, I think there's a lot there, even for-profit businesses. So Doug, I really appreciate you taking time to join us for this first conversation. Look forward to having you come back in a second conversation next Monday. If people want to get in touch with you, ask some questions about what they heard today or talk to you about some coaching, what's the best way for them to do that?
Best way to do it, Rick, is on my website at Doug Thorpe. That's THORPE.com. That is my blog page, and I've got a lot of information there about these coaching programs and others. So that's the fastest way to do it.
Well, it's great information. I encourage you, if you're listening, to take a look at that webpage, if nothing else, about the team trust model. It's really got some thoughtful things put in it. Maybe create your own model if you need to, but it's a great step-by-step tool, I think, to help you build a better team in your business. We are visiting with Doug Thorpe. Doug Thorpe is talking to us about building better teams by becoming a better leader. And Doug, we've been talking a lot about the attributes, the 6 attributes that you have in your team trust model. But there's some other issues I know that you want to talk about. Kind of give us a recap of that conversation, and then we'll move forward.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. You know, the idea of how do we build a better team has been written about by some great business writers like Stephen Covey and John Collins. And, you know, they use interesting phrases like get the right people on the bus. And while I think those are absolutely true, I guess the direction I'm coming from and why I call this building better teams by becoming a better leader, I firmly believe it's the leader's role to kind of set the course for what the team's going to be doing. And absolutely, once you get a vision, you've got to try to recruit for and train up the right people to be on it. But finding that moment of clarity to communicate to everybody is so critical. And I can't tell you, time and time again, I'll go into a client's operation and find out that there is a giant question mark hovering over the whole enterprise. The leader thinks they've done a good job of telling a story, or, you know, maybe they've got a fancy vision statement on the wall and everybody's supposed to just automatically get it. But when you get that team assembled in a room and you start having that discussion, it's amazing how many times there really isn't that perfect clarity.
And, you know, you say perfect clarity. I've even bumped into situations myself in the work I do. There is almost no clarity. And I smiled when you said that sign on the wall, in that case, a mission or a vision statement. And a lot of times that's the lip service. We put up the sign, we work up the vision statement, and then we just stick it on the wall and say, well, that takes care of it.
Right. That's right. And I routinely see teams that have come together and there's a lot of assumption about what the purpose is and, you know, why everybody is gathered. But yet, when you really start polling and you say, all right, this means X, Y, and Z, you'll get 2 or 3 hands around the table going, no, I don't think we do that here. I don't think that's what we are about. And then that's where the leader needs to be able to bring that clarity. So I guess the bottom line, you might say, if you're the leader, manager, owner, you can't assume anything about the understanding of that clarity. And that clarity is so critical for your team to be able to rally around it, make a personal commitment to participate in that, and then carry the process forward.
What are some ways that we can help the leader? I mean, as you say, in your opinion, it centers around this leader. What are some things we can do to help them?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm thinking about a case in point recently I had a client. I was actually asked to come attend a team meeting event where people were being gathered. They don't normally get to work close to each other because they're geographically dispersed, but they do make it a habit to periodically come together. And I asked the question, does everybody understand why you're here and what you're doing? And they looked at me like I had a third eye. But then I said, no, seriously, can each of you articulate the purpose for this team? And sure enough, as I recall, there were 9 members of that team. We had 8 different answers for what the real core purpose of the team was. It was an eye-opener to the executive who was running the team. He was certain he had done a good job of communicating the clarity, and both as a team and one-on-one when he was talking with his people. But in fact, it was obvious that wasn't the case. So the agenda for the day became more about resetting that vision, trying to achieve the clarity so that then he could ask for the commitment from the team on what they were doing.
Just to ask you in that example, if you recall, what was the impression on the team, on the leader of that team, when you went around the room, polled everybody, and he saw what has happened or what was happening? What kind of impression did he have?
Well, fortunately, this executive was a pretty capable leader with some good mileage and good experience behind him. So while on one hand, I think he was disappointed to hear that the clarity was missing, he was quick to own up. And in our earlier segment, I talked about the acronym FAST that stands for Focus, Accountability, Simplicity, and Transparency. In this case, he became incredibly transparent and said, guys, wow, we need to take a step back and we need to dive into this because it is important that we have this clarity around what we're doing.
Let's talk a little bit about clarity. I suspect that some of our listeners are not sure exactly when you talk about clarity what you're really talking about. Can you help us define that?
Yeah, in simple terms, it's the idea. Let's take the situation of an entrepreneur who has this brilliant idea for the business they want to create. Well, in your mind, it's crystal clear. You know what kind of product you want to create, what kind of service you want to deliver, all the different attributes. And so you begin building this team around you, and the clarity you might have in your own mind is not necessarily shared by everyone on the team. So it is very important. And it does go back. Also in our first segment, we talked about my 6-step team trust model. Step 1 is the people, they have to ask the question, do I even want to be on this team? 2 is the purpose, and 3 is the plan. That's where the leader really needs to plot the course. They need to be able to get everybody to rally around the right purpose with the right plan. So then the individual can vote with his heart and his mind to make a commitment to the team.
Let's talk about that. As you said, vote with to the commitment, so to speak. What are some ways or a way that when I'm trying to develop this clarity with my team, that I really know that they're understanding and getting that feedback? In other words, it's not just a yes answer, yes, I understand, or whatever. What are some ways that I can check in, so to speak, to make sure that they are on board with what we're doing?
Well, again, a great question. I think in the spirit of trying to build a high level of trust for your team, the leader needs to be willing to establish that one-on-one relationship with each team member. And in that process of talking one-on-one with your team, you need to ask those questions. You can ask for feedback. If you just came out of a team meeting and somebody you can tell by their body language is balking or not so sure about what you're talking about, pull them off to the side, very calmly and politely ask for feedback. Say, what did you hear? I sensed a pause in your spirit about what we're doing here. And, the person could have been vocal or maybe they weren't vocal, but you saw indications they weren't getting it. So you've got to take that person offline and try to work with them and find out exactly where they are.
My sense of this is, particularly if I have a new team, say I have new business or I'm growing a business and I've added people fairly quickly as I'm growing, I'm being successful, so to speak, in one sense of the word, that I've got some real work to do as a leader to make sure each one of those team members, particularly as they're newer, if you will, to the business, to the company, that they are on board, that they get it, and again they buy into it and are willing to support it. Any advice there of what to do? I mean, you had the meeting. You just mentioned an example where you pull one off to the side that you were able to tell wasn't connecting or on the same page. What about, I mean, this is a project. I mean, this is something you got to work on.
Yeah, it is. It's really an ongoing project. It is a challenge for leadership to stay with it, stay the course, work through this process. But that's why my experience has shown me that this team trust model that I'm an advocate of is such an interesting roadmap to get your team to higher levels of performance. Specific to your question, that individual that's kind of lagging, if the rest of the team is on pace and getting it, if the right level of trust has been established, they help each other. They pull each other along. They realize when someone is not getting it or having a challenge, perhaps something in the business has changed and 5 out of 6 have gotten it and that 6th person is lagging or missing it. They actually end up helping themselves as a team pull together, bring that person along, and actually help the leader by not putting the 100% responsibility on the leader to make that happen.
You've said something really important, and I want to make sure that our listeners all get it, and that's the fact that this process, if you will, is ongoing. It isn't just the meeting, then checking in with people that may or may not get it, but it really needs to become part of I call the DNA of that leader going forward on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis.
It really is. When we began this discussion, we said the ultimate success of a team really starts with the leader, and that is true. And it does require a constant monitoring, a constant feedback to the team members by the leaders saying, yes, we're on course. No, we need to adjust something. I had an expectation of such and such, and I need you to step it up, pick it up, talk to me why you're not getting this, those kinds of discussions.
Sounds like what you're doing is really building a model to build the business. And as such, the leader needs to be, and hopefully all the team members involved in it day to day, and probably some subtle ways as well as some obvious ways.
Yeah, and we have spoken about the idea of hiring is so critically important to that. And I think John Collins in his book, Good to Great, talks about that exhaustively, having done a number of studies on big businesses and how they've been able to do it. I guess, not to be crude about it, but the old saying, garbage in is garbage out. If you haven't been able to hire the right people to be on your team, that's going to make it a near impossible adjustment to make. So starting with the right people on your team is certainly critical to being able to align everybody, explain the purpose, show them your plan, and then talk about how you're going to execute.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. Once you get the clarity working with your team, are there some other things you can do to build a better, stronger team?
Yeah, I go back to the 6-step model, which we've shared here, and there is an online version of this on my website, dougthorpe.com/team trust, one word. That's dougthorpe.com/team trust. The other steps involve, once everybody is aligned with the team, the purpose and the plan, then you get into practice. And you're out in the trenches doing the job, doing the work. And you have to have kind of a constant feedback process to say, well, is this effort working? What do we need to adjust? If it's a major shift, you got to have some education and learning to help your team understand what the change is. And in a fashion, they potentially go all the way back to step 1 in the model here, asking themselves, wow, with that change, do I still want to be on this team? So it is an ever dynamic loop. And some clients I've worked with that they look at this, they almost challenge and say, well, is this not really similar to Maslow's hierarchy? You start out at step 1 with basic fundamental needs and you work your way up to self-actualization. And a team goes through that kind of process as well. They start out at a very fundamental level. Who am I? Why am I here? What are we doing? And then you slowly work up the process until you finally achieve your payoff. And then with the payoff in hand, and again, that's either monetary or intangible, as in the case of many nonprofits. With that payoff in hand, you can go back to that front end and say, okay, this is good. Why am I here? Oh, this is great. I want to stay here and let's do it some more.
Well, and that makes a lot of sense, is getting that buy-in and someone recognizing that they're where they need to be. Well, let me ask you this. Okay, we've talked about this building, using the model, the team trust model, building that trust up to a point. Kind of double back and look back over that for us, if you would, and talk about really what are the real benefits of using this approach.
The first big benefit is the idea that with your team hitting on all six cylinders here, you actually start to create big momentum for your business. And you cannot underestimate the value of momentum. We hear it talked about in sporting events. The team recovers a fumble and starts driving back for a winning touchdown. They talk about big momentum shifts. Well, in business, momentum is actually very tangible also. And if your team is really hitting it and doing well, working together as a well-oiled machine might, you sense that momentum. And what momentum does for you is you might lose a member of your team, life change or whatever takes them away. Putting another person in that slot, if the team is already operating at a high level, that momentum is going to carry them even through that transition with the new member.
Doug, you were talking about momentum and how important it is, and you woke me up a little bit. I'll be frank with you about, of course, the momentum in sports. I agree. It's in the current basketball playoffs. It's everything, baseball, football, all around us in sports. But I'm not sure that I even think about it that often, that the momentum, once a business is moving and growing, we read these success stories about all the noise that goes on when you're moving forward and everybody's excited and everybody's pulling. But what that is you're saying, is a direct result of using a model such as the team trust model and building up your team so that they can create that momentum.
Right. Yeah, I think it's safe to say if you take the counter position and think about that, I don't know any business that I can think of in my past that is achieving levels of success with constant conflict, frustration, turnover, retraining, re-educating the team. I don't know any business that is able to achieve their maximum capacity when that all is going on. So that's what I'm talking about with momentum, is when you overcome those things and you start getting a regular rhythm to your business and kind of a hum to the activity that's going on. It's seldom that you see a business that has that hum that's not doing some great things.
You touched on some important things. You touched on some things that are, I guess, call them negatives in a general sense, where you have turnover and you have this and that. And if that's going on in your business, that in itself is a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're not doing well if you're not addressing those issues. But then it becomes a recovery effort. If I've got a lot of turnover, my approach typically is, well, I've got to fix that problem. It's not to step back and say, hey, maybe I need to find a new way overall. How do you convince someone that they need, they say, well, I've got a lot of turnover, Doug, help me with this. How do you convince them to step back and take a look at something like the team trust model?
Well, I've definitely had that occasion with a client when he presents me with all of his problems and I start proposing some changes and I get pushback, and he'll say things like, well, this is the way we've always done it. And the classic retort from me is, well, how's that working out for you? You just gave me a list of problems, and don't you think they go hand in hand? So there are business situations when ultimately you say to somebody, why don't you just start this over with a different plan?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I would assume it'd be very challenging to bring that up to somebody that has the obvious signs. And if you're listening to this program, take a look at your own business. See if you have some of these recurring problems and you can't seem to get past them. And I think it's because you're just trying to fix that problem. You're not addressing the whole. Well, Doug, as we wind down this part of our conversation, I think it'd be a great idea, if you don't mind, share with us some case studies, some actual cases or situations that you've been in that reflect the real value of following the team trust model.
Yeah, one that comes immediately to mind, I know of a situation where the team is comprised of some very highly skilled, highly trained, highly technical people, and the team leader made the quick assumption that everybody got it, that the team had been constituted for a particular mission. I think the team leader was thinking, well, these guys are smart. They've been doing this a long time. Certainly, we can just go to work and everything will be fine. And yet, when the team was pulled together and the discussion about clarity came up, which I basically ask every team meeting I'm in just to get a gauge on where they might be, the answer was no. You know, I've got my P's, he's got his P's, her P's, et cetera, et cetera. So the assumption based on technical expertise is not a good one. I think it goes without saying that regardless of the skill and education of your people, there's still always that need for that, you know, proverbial flag to go in the sand for everybody to rally around and say, no, this is what we're about. This is what we need to be doing. Now let's have the discussion. How can we leverage our strengths and talents to get there?
Well, yeah, that old world assumption, we know about that. It bites you each and every time. Why not right here?
Right.
Makes sense that happens.
Right.
Any other case studies jump out to you, jump out in your mind that would help people understand or tangibilize, so to speak?
Well, I'll tell a story on myself. I have alluded to it before, and in my own experience trying to start up a company, I was too quick to assume that everybody could understand the mission. I thought we had a very clear definition of the service we were going to be providing. I thought it was pretty simple to understand. And as I brought people into the team, the training was marginal at best, and I'm telling a story on myself. Training was marginal at best, and then people were handed a book of business to go get busy on, and next thing I knew, things were popping up. Pieces of the deliverables that we were responsible for were not getting done correctly, and the service levels my company was delivering were not that great. So it took some real adjustment to the process with the people I had. I got real aggressive with evaluating who I had and made some intentional cuts to the team, changed my whole recruiting practice. In this case, I actually created a practical test I gave recruits to not just talk me through what they thought they knew about our business, but show me what they knew about our business. My success in recruiting went, well, I would say through the roof, and the ability to have a team that was operating at a much higher level grew very rapidly after that.
You know, one of the things, just kind of pick on one little issue, and we've talked about it really in our first conversation and now in this conversation, is a leader really needs to develop some skills as far as evaluating hiring people.
Yeah.
I hear that time and again. Any quick thoughts on that to encourage someone to develop those skills?
Well, I think the quick answer is, not to make it sound oversimplified, but if you're not happy with the quality of hires you're making, something's got to change. You either need to reevaluate your own process or your own decision-making, or find better alternatives on how to evaluate that. Like I mentioned in my example, I actually created a practical test to give to recruits rather than talking through the business, because our business was one that was, a lot of people knew the vocabulary of the industry and could talk it through without really knowing anything about the work at all. So we created this practical test, and that really made a change. I actually had recruits, we told them they were going to take a practical test, and they declined the interview.
Wow. That is interesting in and of itself.
Yep.
Yeah, a lot of traps out there in the interviewing process, and it's something I've personally been blessed to have a lot of opportunity for training and attend seminars, and I've molded a process together, and it's a never learning thing. But obviously, it's a key to a successful business. There's just no doubt about it. Hiring the right people for the right slot.
Absolutely.
Well, Doug, I've enjoyed this part of the conversation as I did the first. I think I'm kind of excited. We're going to have a third conversation and kind of bring everything into focus, so to speak. And I hope you as listeners have enjoyed this and re-listen to it. There's a lot of good takeaways in this conversation. So, Doug, thanks, and we'll be with you again next week. Well, this is our third and final conversation. We're talking with Doug Thorpe, the originator of the Team Trust model. Doug, you've delivered a lot of great information in our previous two conversations about the topic and building a better team through this process. Let's kind of move on, and in a sense, we'll take this opportunity over the course of this conversation to kind of wrap things up. Kind of recap, if you would, the idea that we've been talking about, if you would, so everybody can catch up with us if they haven't listened to the previous shows.
Sure, Rick. What we were talking about in the Team Trust model you alluded to is really a 6-step model that helps understand the dynamic of building a high-performance team. Studies have shown us, specifically most recently, the good folks at Google did their own 2-year study on their high-performing teams. They called it Project Oxygen, and one of the biggest factors in the highest performing teams was something they call psychological safety. And if you read through the text of that report, what you come away with is a modern definition of trust. Being able, creating an environment where your team has a very high level of trust. So you say, all right, great, how do we build that? I've presented a 6-step model that starts with your people. They have to ask and answer the question, do I even want to be on this team? They have a purpose. Number 2, what is this team trying to accomplish? This, again, these are questions in the mind of each one of your team members. Step number 3 is the plan. They will ask, how will the team get this thing done? Number 4 is the practice. Some call it execution. They ask the question, what works and what doesn't? And then number 5 is performance. Once we get busy and get to work, how are we going to be measured? How are we going to know we're creating any level of success, and how can we improve it? And then lastly, number 6 is the payoff. Everybody's looking for that final reward, whether it's financial or psychological. I've reminded us in our discussion here that payoff can come in the way of intangible results, as in a lot of work that our great nonprofits do in our communities. But getting these 6 steps operating at a high level, you will ultimately create a team that operates with a high level of trust. And that's why it's so important to think about each one of these. This is a dynamic wheel that creates momentum for your company and keeps people moving forward. And it almost becomes a kind of self-fulfilling momentum once kind of high velocity has been achieved.
You know, kind of backtrack a little bit. One of the things that you mentioned for the 6th step, the payoff. To me, that's one of the most challenging things to do, is to determine what the payoff needs to be so it does motivate. And in this case, also come back and help build the trust.
Right.
Any words of wisdom to the listeners about how to approach the payoff, whether it's monetary, non-monetary? How do you determine what works best with your team?
I think that's a great question, and it's an age-old challenge. I hear it all the time from my colleagues in the HR realm who are tasked with trying to maintain employee engagement, and they are constantly looking at that payoff aspect. And studies are telling us that the money reward is not always the answer. There are a lot of situations where people can be real happy with the money, but they're not satisfied with something else going on at the company. So I'm not trying to dodge the question, but the reality is I think there is no one-size-fit-all answer here. I think your own company dictates, and your own environment, your own industry may dictate the best payoff. Keep in mind, under the concept of my model that I'm presenting here, this payoff question is ultimately in the mind of the employee. It's like, am I getting the payoff I need and expect? And is it enough to make me want to continue here? And certainly, is it enough to make me want to continue at the high level that I think I've been contributing? You know, to get that feedback and know whether or not enough is enough, it's another example of the constant communication that has to be going on with your team.
You know, it's funny that I 100% agree with you on that. It's so many times business owners, managers seem afraid, I guess is the right word, to have the feedback about compensation or the payoff from the employees. And to me, I don't know how you do it without talking with them. Of course, as you build trust, then you have that trust, and the stronger the trust, the better that conversation is as far as the communication is straight and up front.
Well, I'm reminded of a story that happened to me in my early career. I lobbied for. I was a unit leader in my banking organization. I had about 14 employees, and I lobbied for some bonus checks for my people. They weren't going to be big, but they had been through a season of some really intense activity. I thought they had all done well, and I decided to submit for some bonus checks. Well, like I said, they weren't going to be particularly big, but it was going to be more of the gesture that was going to be important. What ended up happening, the checks got approved, but when they hit people's payroll, depending on where that person was on the tax schedule, it was either a serious detriment because it took them into a whole new tax bracket that took a lot more out of their check than they had been getting before, and the net was actually negative. And I was young and naive at the time, and nobody in HR warned me of that, and we did it, and I had about a third of my team more upset than they were excited about having gotten that little bonus check.
Yeah, I learned that lesson as well. In fact, now I encourage my clients to issue a separate check for the full amount and then just put the taxes on the regular payroll check.
Right.
In fact, I had a situation the other day that they actually did that. They did it before I got to them. I said, boy, you really understand, don't you? That's a great story. Well, let's talk about some of the things that you've been, and you've told, I know, one story on yourself, but you've been part of some successful teams. Tell us about what that looked like from your perspective of being a team member, not necessarily a team leader, or when you were in the case of what you just discussed, being a leader. What has your experience taught you or shown you?
Well, when I look back on my career, there are certainly some great opportunities I've had, including a small organization called the United States Army. We certainly had a combination of team effectiveness there. Some teams were great to be on, others were not so great. I think anyone that's ever served in the military probably understands what I'm talking about. You can find some great examples of team dynamics there. Certainly I was not a part of it, but you think of elite squads like the Navy SEALs or the Army Green Berets. The training there gets you to another point. Talk about clarity of purpose. I think those are pretty high examples to look at. But for me, one of the moments in civilian life that I reflect on, in my early career, I had joined a local banking organization in the Houston area called Texas Commerce. And I had no idea about the nature of that bank or the level of sophistication in how that bank ran. But being young and new to that industry, I just assumed everything we did there was some kind of normal approach. I only found out much later after I left the bank that it was a one-of-a-kind. The leadership lab we had, I think, was phenomenal. the old saying is iron sharpens iron, and we definitely had a cadre of pretty high caliber bank officers and executives that ran our organization and modeled behaviors that we all needed to embrace. And talk about accountability, we had a very rigorous budgeting process that plotted our course year over year. And some people, quite frankly, didn't survive the scrutiny that budget demanded. But those that did, we had an organization that created 64 consecutive quarters of earnings growth. So we're talking 16 years of performance.
Wow.
With successive consecutive earnings growth. And there was definitely a culture there among the leadership. It was something that I don't think anyone ever questioned clarity. We've talked a lot about that during our time together here. I don't think anyone ever questioned the clarity and certainly not our purpose for being who and what we were. So that is a model that's been ingrained in my mind and in my heart, and I try to share that with clients today on how to get there. And a lot of it comes down to, I'm going to depart here or a minute on a little tangent. A lot of it comes down to the communication with your employees, with your teams, to maintain that perfect clarity about your purpose. Why are you operating? What are you there for? What does it mean? What is our plan? Et cetera, et cetera. Keeping that communication wide open all the time is so incredibly vital to that.
Well, that's obviously a great piece of advice for a business owner today. Is there anything else that you could tell our business owners who are listening how to get the most out of their teams?
Well, I'll start by saying leadership is not automatic. If you have created a business, you may need to take a serious look in the mirror and ask yourself the question, am I really the right person to lead this? I may have the intellectual capital that started this business, but do I really have the leadership toolkit to make it go? And there are many stories that are now legend about creators that gave up the leadership because they were smart enough to know they didn't have it, and they needed to learn it, or they needed to follow somebody else's lead in getting things done. They could stay in the room, they could have a seat at the table to continue to plot the vision, but they knew they just didn't have what it took to execute.
Yeah, that's a very, very difficult decision for the typical small business or business owner to succeed and allow even it. I find people have difficulty just succeeding, opening up the store, so to speak. I mean, and to get to that level, you're talking about some legends like you mentioned, because the exceptions are rare that somebody can start from scratch and lead it into millions, billions, whatever, wherever you want to go. Let's talk a little bit about, and you mentioned team leadership is not automatic, okay? But when you start a company, you have a team, you must be the leader. Well, that makes sense. Talk about that, though, that when I start a company, because I've met too many entrepreneurs that don't really look at themselves as a leader. They're a business owner, they're an entrepreneur. They'll pick all kinds of titles, but I don't find the title leader saying I'm the leader and I've got to think like a leader. I'm the boss, maybe, but talk about that.
I think that is exactly the heart of the challenge here for owners in so many companies everywhere. They think of themselves as the owner, as the chief executive, or whatever title they choose to give themselves. But the key interest here, the key question is, are you really leading your team? It's one thing to manage a team, to get them to understand the next button to push or the next screw to turn to get the work done, but that is ultimately just management. We get into the discussion of the difference between management and leadership. The best simple example, or I've heard of that, to explain it is that management is about process and leadership is about people. So you can manage a process all day long, and you can get results. You can sell units, you can deliver service with nothing but a pure management approach. But if you want long-term success and even higher levels of success, you've got to delve into the ability to lead your people. And that's why the things I talk about in my 6-step trust model really cover those bases, helping your team become a better team through real leadership.
Well, it all makes a lot of sense to me, and I appreciate, we've come a long way in this conversation, and there's some issues I'd like to take up when we start up again, specific things such as delegation, accountability. But for now, let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Well, we went to the break. We've talked a lot about generalities in our multiple conversations, but there's some key areas. One of them is delegation, and we've touched on that. Delegating the day-to-day operations is sort of the top of that list, or delegating, as I brought up, the opening of the store, so to speak, to someone. Let's talk about delegation and why is it always hard for owners to let go?
It is hard for owners to let go. And whether you want to call it pride of authorship or an owner's lack of trust in the people that are around them, it runs the full gamut of rationale for not being willing to delegate. But when I work with my clients, when the subject of delegation comes up, I love a very basic definition that I learned a long time ago. Delegation is much like parenting. There is permission and there is protection. So let's talk about those two pieces. Permission is probably easier to understand. When you delegate to your team, you're telling them, I give you permission to go do this on my behalf. You can, when you're speaking, when you're acting, when you're executing, it's as though it was me, and that's okay. I give you permission to do that. Now, obviously, you do that with a backdrop of communication. You have some learning and training that goes with that to say to somebody, all right, now you get it, go with my blessing. The protection side is the one that I think confuses people when we start talking about that. Protection is not about defining a boundary around the permission you've given them. It's really on the after action side of it. It's what if you go out, you've got permission, you go out on my behalf, you do something and it's not right or it doesn't work out. What's going to happen? A lot of owners operate in a punitive way when that happens. The employee's sitting there thinking, well, I reached out and it didn't work out, and now you're going to punish me for it? Well, protection says, no, I'm not going to punish you. I've got your back. I'm going to cover. I will work with you and we'll make this right. We'll fix whatever happened that wasn't right or wasn't well. And it's okay. I told you to go do it. I told you you had that permission. It didn't work out well. Fine. I'll deal with it. Don't worry about it. And it's that constant cycle of giving permission and providing protection that really makes for effective delegation.
I was listening to you and I got a little smile on my face because every time we talk about something, trust comes up as the foundational issue, which it is. And the fact that in that conversation that you say, hey, it's okay, we'll make it right, we'll do it.
That's right.
You've got to have trust between, in that case, the owner trusts the employee, what they did, and so on and so forth, and willing to step in and make it right. I've seen too many bosses just go off, on the employee, and there's no trust factor. You're tearing any trust down when you do that. So the whole idea is on a day-to-day basis, as a manager, as an owner, I need to think maybe first and foremost as I drive to the office or drive to the business about what can I do today to build some trust.
Yeah, it's a classic debate and understanding. Trust is very much a two-way street, especially in business. If you want your team to trust you and the company, well, you have to trust them. You have to demonstrate that, and as the owner /manager/leader, you have to be the one setting the course for that. And you have to trust first to allow your employees to come back and trust your system, your plan, your process.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, let's talk about, what about accountability? I mean, that's always on everybody's list. I need my folks to be accountable, or in turn, the manager being accountable to the employees. And transparency. Start with accountability. What's going on there?
Yeah, accountability. It just hit me. I think we've kind of been beaten up on owners quite a bit, and that's probably not fair. So any of you that have listened and thought I was doing that, I'm sorry. But here's where I'll turn it around. It is absolutely reasonable for an owner to expect some accountability from their employees. You hired them, you've given them an opportunity. There needs to be accountability, but it starts with you expressing a clear message of your expectation. You cannot keep moving the goalposts, is the phrase I've heard a lot on this topic. You can't change the goals and expectations on a regular basis. You have to set a course. You have to say, in your seat, in your job, here's what I need you to do. And whatever level that is, whether you want to measure it by volume or transaction count, transaction quality, there are a lot of measures out there, but the accountability has to start with that statement of expectation. Now, when an employee doesn't meet that expectation, you need to have a healthy conversation with them about it and not be punitive right out of the gate. You need to express your disappointment that the expectation has not been met, and do that in a way that there is some opportunity for remediation, that the employee doesn't feel totally blown up and devalued by the company, but they see some light for opportunity to improve.
Yeah, very, very important. What about transparency?
Well, transparency, I think, goes hand in hand with that, and it's actually, in my mind, similar to what we talked about a minute ago with trust. If the leader wants transparency from their team, they're going to have to be transparent themselves. They're going to have to be able to relate to their employees. They're going to have to be able to share things with their employees. You don't have to get personal to the level you're divulging all your life at home kind of stories, but you have to be relevant. You have to be able to relate to them, and in that, the other thing about transparency from the leader's standpoint is being willing to admit your own mistakes. Everybody knows in our gut. I don't know who taught it to us first, but the old phrase, "Nobody's perfect." Well, there are too many owners and business leaders that believe they are perfect. And so when there's a mistake, they're either going to blame it on somebody else or find a way to rationalize it like it wasn't really a mistake, when everybody around the table knows it was. So that's where transparency starts, is just, owning up to it and say, you know what, guys, I blew that one. That's all on me. And if you can do that, you're going to start building a climate of transparency that all your other employees can rally around. Just like in the case when we're talking about delegation, if an employee's been delegated a task, goes out and blows it, if you've got transparency, they will be just like you were. They'll come in and say, "Boss, this didn't turn out the way I wanted it to. I'm very sorry. What do you want to do?" And then you can have that moment to say, "Okay, I promised you protection. Yes, let's figure it out."
Yeah, well, that obviously makes a lot of sense. I would be remiss if I allowed us to finish this conversation and not mention a book that you've written, the book, The Uncommon Commodity, A Common Sense Guide of New Managers. Just take a second and tell us about the book and perhaps where we can get a copy.
Yeah, I wrote that book about 2 years ago, and I really had a passion. I talked to a lot of people, and maybe it's because I have 5 young adult children of my own, and I've watched them enter the workforce and take on leadership responsibilities. We have an odd tradition in our business world. We take our highest performer and we promote them to be a manager, and 9 times out of 10, what we've just done is ruined our best producer. So it's very important that those first-time managers get a shot at learning something about management and leadership so that they can do a better job in making their new first team responsibilities be more successful. It's funny, I wrote that book, and I've got it split up in a couple of topical sections about people and trust and management. But in my mind, I was writing it to first-time managers, as the title suggests, but a lot of my colleagues have read it, and they said, oh, goodness, I forgot about this. Thank you for reminding me. And so it's a good read for everybody, really, that is in any kind of ownership and leadership position.
Well, I appreciate that. And where can we get the book?
It is on Amazon.
Okay.
And through the bookstore at Amazon.
That's fantastic. Well, we've got about a minute left. Quick recap.
Well, I think the question about how do you build a better team, well, first you got to be a better leader, and the way we do that is building trust inside of our team environment. And I do have a 6-step model that's available for viewing on my website at dougthorpe.com/teamtrust. If you want to take a look, that's where to go, and be happy to talk with anyone that has questions about it.
And again, how can they best contact you?
Through my website, Doug Thorpe, that's THORPE.com, and in this case, /Team Trust, one word. That'll get you to the 6-step model we've been talking about. But all my blog content, my other articles and comments are there on the website.
I will tell you, if you're listening, there's a lot of great information there. I encourage you, if you just want to check and learn, go to that website. If you're going to contact Doug, that's fantastic as well. Well, we've had a great conversation, Doug. I thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. Building better teams by becoming a better leader. Great stuff. I encourage folks to take a look at his book, Uncommon Commodity, and build a better team for you and your business by being the leader that you need to be.
OneBestConsult.com, a community of small business owners where you as an owner can find answers to the most pressing business questions you have. Not sure who to turn to when you have a challenge in your business? Turn to the folks at OneBestConsult.com. That's the number one, bestconsult.com, where you can always find advice you can use based on common sense business experience. Join our community of like-minded business owners at OneBestConsult.com.